When Apple released the 16-inch MacBook Pro, it was extremely well received, and that's because it fixed many of the issues that the 15-inch model had. It was thicker, but with noticeably better thermals, it had an 11-hour battery life from 10, it had a larger display with thinner bezels, and more importantly, it fixed the butterfly keyboard by replacing it with something more familiar. We did a video on the major 14-inch MacBook Pro redesign, however, this video is all about the 16-inch MacBook Pro. So get us snacks ready, and let's take a look. Okay, so we know that the MacBook Pros are long overdue a design overhaul. Apple used to update their design every 4 years, but the current gen MacBook Pros are approaching 5. You could maybe count the 16-inch as sort of a redesign if you really want to push it, but it was definitely nothing to the extent that we were used to. So what sort of changes do we expect the 16-inch MacBook Pro redesign to get? Well, at number 1, we have the thickness. You see, currently the 16-inch MacBook Pro is 1.63 centimeters thick. The M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch is 1.55. And while that might not seem like a lot, it is very noticeable if you compared it to side by side. Based on the initial leaks, we knew that the upcoming 14-inch MacBook Pro would use a design language similar to the iPad Pro and the iPhone 12 line, which means that rather than having this thick underside, the MacBook Pro would just have the flat portion and therefore it would be much thinner. The 16-inch MacBook Pro would of course follow the same design language, but it could still be slightly thicker than the 14-inch to incorporate the more power-hungry components, which I'm going to cover once we get to the performance section of this video. Speaking of the design, you've probably heard that Quanta Computer, who operates one of Apple's main production factories, has recently been hacked. The hackers did post some schematics, which were then reposted by 9to5Mac and other publications. One of them perfectly matches the recently announced iMac, while the other one seems to show an upcoming MacBook, likely the 14-inch MacBook Pro. And from the looks of it, the design does actually clash with the initial reports that it would feature that flat design. And that's because based on these schematics, it seems like the design is more rounded than we thought, resembling the old 2008 MacBook, just, of course, much thinner. 9to5Mac did a quick render of this, and seeing it in the render, I gotta say, it doesn't actually look that bad. I do quite like it. It resembles the Razer Blade Studio, just much thinner. So there is a good chance that this will be the design language that the new MacBook Pros would go for. Although, I would still prefer a design similar to our concept with this super flat look. And here's the thing, if Apple does go for this flat design, the MacBook Pros would perfectly match the iPhone, the iPad, and even the new iMac's design language, whereas the rounded look would just look a bit out of place. But I guess that after what Apple did with the iMac, literally anything could happen. Speaking of things happening, only 22.4% of you watching this video are actually subscribed to the channel, which means that 77.6% of you watching this video right now are not subscribed, which is really weird. So do subscribe, it's free, and we'll be making way more videos on the 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pro once they're out, benchmarks, comparisons, and everything you need to know. Yeah, we got you covered. Now, the second change that the 16-inch MacBook Pro will introduce is a potential removal of the touch bar. Mark Gurman reported that Apple does actually have prototype MacBook Pros that do not have the touch bar at all and instead have physical function keys, like the MacBook Air does. And guess what? This new schematic leak also shows the lack of the touch bar, which is pretty disappointing to me. I mean, I mentioned this in previous videos, the fact that I really hope that Apple doesn't remove it, as sometimes it is useful to have for things like adjusting the volume or the brightness. I just think that it needs a lot more work, such as making it wider, and especially fixing all the freezes, which by the way, still happen even on the M1 MacBook Pro. So do let me know in the comments, what do you guys think Apple should do? Number 3, the ports. Yes, we are finally getting some more ports. We've seen a bunch of rumors, including reports from credible sources such as Mark Gurman and Ming-Chi Kuo, saying that Apple plans on bringing back the SD card reader, the HDMI ports, as well as MagSafe to this new generation of MacBook Pros. Now, I was a bit skeptical of this, especially when it came to the HDMI ports, as a lot of new monitors do come with a USB Type-C cable nowadays, so I don't think that's needed. When it comes to the SD card reader, not all cameras have USB-C ports, so that is indeed more important to have. But now the question is, does this new schematic leak show anything in terms of the ports? And yes, it does. On the right-hand side, we have an HDMI port alongside one USB Type-C/Thunderbolt port and an SD card reader. On the left, we have two more USB Type-C/Thunderbolt ports alongside the MagSafe charging port. Keep in mind that this is the 14-inch model. The 16-inch might even have more ports over these ones, but these ones are definitely expected to be on the 16-inch model. Now, the best thing about this new 16-inch MacBook Pro is that it will be a major improvement performance-wise over the current Intel model, which means that all of your apps and games will run so much better. Oh, and speaking of apps, Mac apps are pretty expensive. So what if you could get access to hundreds of apps for free? Well, now you can with Setapp, our sponsor for this video. Setapp has over 200 apps, with more apps added on a regular basis. They offer a free 7-day trial, after which you can continue with your plan, starting from just $8.99 a month. That's less than if you were to buy most of these apps individually. With Setapp, you think tasks, not apps. Simply search for a specific use case, and Setapp will show you what tool they have for the job. General management tools, security, remote work, productivity, Setapp has an app for pretty much anything. For example, they have the Gemini app, which removes duplicate files from your Mac, or Clean My Mac X, an app that I use every time to check that everything is running fine on my Mac, or iStat Menus, the first third-party app that I install the moment I get a new Mac. And there are a ton more apps. Use the link below to try Setapp for free. Okay, the fourth big upgrade is in terms of the display. We know that this new generation of MacBook Pros will be getting mini LED displays, which means that the brightness would be much higher and the black levels would also be much better. Mini LED does feature multiple dimming zones, which means that we'll get an image quality that is in between OLED and LCD. I'm pretty excited for Mini LED myself, however, I would have much preferred if Apple used OLED panels instead. Of course, that OLED also has a risk of burn-in, so you have to be really careful when you use OLED on devices that have permanent menu bars, like, computers do. And OLED would have also meant a lower brightness overall. So I think that when it comes to laptops, Mini LED is the best technology that we have right now. But okay, aside from the change to Mini LED, the 16-inch MacBook Pro is also getting thinner bezels. Now, the side ones are likely going to remain the same, as those were already very thin, but the top and bottom bezels are likely going to be getting much thinner. Unfortunately, the display size is staying the same, at least according to the leaks, but we could see a change in the aspect ratio here, with Apple making it taller in order to be able to make the top and bottom bezels thinner. Okay, at number 5, we have the battery. You see, the 16-inch MacBook Pro did manage to give us an amazing 11-hour battery life, which for a prosumer laptop was pretty amazing. However, once Apple introduced the M1 processor, the 13-inch model literally doubled the battery life from 10 hours to 20 hours. So if Apple were to just add the M1 into the 16-inch MacBook Pro, we would see up to a 22-hour battery life, which is absolutely insane on a prosumer laptop. However, it is very unlikely that Apple will include the M1. And that's because number 6, the 16-inch MacBook Pro is expected to also come with some major performance improvements. You see, the M1 is, at the moment, the most powerful laptop processor on the market. And that's very surprising considering that the M1 has a TDP of just 10 to 15 watts compared to 45 to 65 watts, which is what an equivalent processor from Intel has. But that is only when we're talking about the CPU performance. On the GPU side, whilst the M1 is more powerful than any integrated GPU, it still lags far behind any dedicated GPU. Meaning that we cannot actually use an M1 for video editing ourselves, as our videos do have 3D effects and callouts, which the M1 GPU cannot handle. Now, the 13-inch MacBook Pro only had an integrated GPU. Therefore, Apple was easily able to make a model that was way more powerful. However, the 16-inch already has a very powerful dedicated GPU. And in order for Apple to be able to match that, they would need a dedicated GPU of their own, which means that a 16-inch MacBook Pro would either come with an M1 CPU alongside a G1 GPU, or it would come with a way more powerful M1X that would integrate a GPU inside of it, which would be more powerful than the AMD Radeon Pro 5600M GPU inside the top-of-the-line 16-inch model. However, by looking at the ports on the leaked schematic, it seems that the upcoming 14-inch model might still have an M1. And that's because it only has 3 USB Type-C ports rather than 4, which makes me think that 2 of them are actually Thunderbolt ports, while the other one is a standard USB-C port. The reason why I'm saying this is because Apple did the same with the 2021 iMac, where on the high-end model, they have 4 USB-C ports, but only 2 of them are actual Thunderbolt ports. And that is because that's the maximum that the M1 can support. There is of course the chance that the M1X will support 3, but I still find it odd how Apple wouldn't just give us 4 Thunderbolt ports, as that is what we've had on the previous Intel models. Like, I would gladly trade that HDMI port in favor of a Thunderbolt, which is really multiple ports into one. Regardless, the 16-inch MacBook Pro will definitely come with a specialized GPU in order for it to be able to match and even outperform the current model. And finally, let's talk about thermals. The 16-inch MacBook Pro did have improved thermals over the 15-inch model, but if you've seen the M1 Max, you probably know that the M1 runs incredibly cool to the point where you almost never hear the fans, not even when rendering intensive projects. The M1X or the M2 will of course be more powerful, so do expect to hear the fans more often than on the M1 models. But that would still be nothing when compared to how loud the 16-inch model is now. On top of that, if Apple doesn't need to go with that thicker body on the 16-inch model, they could have an even better cooling system than what the 16-inch model has now due to more internal space. Not that Apple's gonna need it, but if Apple wants to give this machine as much performance as possible whilst also keeping the noise levels low, then they might actually go for this approach. But let me know in the comments, what do you guys think? What features do you want to see in this new MacBook Pro, and how would you want it to look like? Anyway, if you have enjoyed this video, definitely give it a like because it does help the algorithm find and push our videos. And also subscribe if you want to see more in-depth tech videos like this one hopefully was. I'm Daniel, this has been Zen of Tech, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Zen of Tech, signing out. Cheers.